Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. I'm Leighton Gray, and this is Gray Matter. Today's commentary deals with a question that a lot of Canadians have right now. Why is our Prime Minister and his government seeking membership in the European Union? This commentary is called CanEuropa: Why Post-Nationhood Points to Membership in the European Union. Begin with a quotation which reads, "The white races of Europe should be destroyed and replaced with the race of Eurasian Negroids, who can be easily controlled by a ruling elite." That is from an EU founding father named Richard Coudenhove Kalergi, circa 1924. Well, there's a version of Canadian history that most of us were never taught in school because it doesn't live in textbooks or in Pierre Berton documentaries. It doesn't appear on the evening news. It has been sitting largely undisturbed in academic journals, government archives, and the Club of Rome's own published documents for over a half century. And that version of history explains everything that is happening in Canada and globally today. It explains the so-called housing crisis. It explains the manufactured energy restrictions. It explains policy-driven immigration pressure. It explains government-made economic stagnation. It explains why a sitting deputy prime minister stood before graduates at a leading American university and asked sincerely, not rhetorically, whether capitalist democracy still works. It explains why Prime Minister Carney wants to surrender our national sovereignty to a cabal of Eastern elitists in Brussels. Make no mistake, none of what is happening to us in Canada today is an accident. It has all been carefully orchestrated and curated for a very long time. We're just living through the final stages, the death throes, if you will, of the true north, strong and free. The nurse is finally at our bedside with our national made injection. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we must first honestly assess what is going on around us. Across Canadian mass media and social media, a coordinated narrative has been built around what is being called the problem of empty bedrooms. On the surface, this sounds like a housing conversation. But if we look closer, we discover that it is something else entirely. The pressure being applied, particularly to elderly Canadians and grandparents who have occupied their homes for decades, is to downsize, to surrender their multi-bedroom homes, to turn their large bedrooms into apartment blocks, glorifying sea cans as desirable dwellings, to downsize not just our homes, but our very expectations about what life will be like in the New World Order. Well, this is not housing policy. This is foundational housing reform, in the same sense that Chairman Mao used the term land reform in China in the 1950s. In China back then, land reform meant state seizure and redistribution of all private property, which is already beginning to happen here in Canada. It meant destroying the existing ownership class. It meant collectivization, and it meant mass murder and genocide. 1 in 6 Chinese died as a direct result of Maoist land reforms. Now, I realize that no one is sending soldiers to our doors in Canada just yet. That might actually spark a revolt amongst Canadians who are actively resisting confiscation of their guns. Instead, what is being deployed is a technique which the CCP perfected called the mass line. The mass line is a propaganda technique whereby the state manufactures a demand, presents it as a grassroots movement, and then it uses the illusion of public consensus to implement the oppressive policy it always intended to impose. The masses did not actually demand it. The party created the demand, packaged it, and handed it back to the masses as our own idea. And naturally, we fall in love with it. There's a cultural weapon being used against Canadians specifically in this operation. In the US, cultural identity is built around individual liberty. In Canada, our identity is being built around the collective. We are Canadians. We are awesome. We are better than the Americans, so elbows up. The beautiful Canadian sense of Christian community, that instinct toward cooperation and shared purpose, is being weaponized against us. The we is being used to ensure compliance. Our national sense of belonging is being turned into a tool of state coercion. This is where Canada is today. But to understand how we got here, we have to go back to the late 1960s. Now, most of us assume that the housing crisis, the energy restrictions, the cost of living collapse, and the economic stagnation all stem from bad policy and economic leadership. But what if I told you that these were not mistakes at all? What if I told you that they planned Canada's decline in 1968 and that there is a paper trail to prove it? Well, consider Exhibit A, the Cloward-Piven strategy. The Cloward-Piven strategy is a political theory outlined in 1966 by American sociologists and political activists Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven. It is the strategy of forcing political change to societal collapse through a series of orchestrated crises. The strategy seeks to hasten the fall of capitalism by overloading the government bureaucracy with a flood of impossible demands, amassing massive, unpayable national debt, and other methods such as unfettered immigration, thus pushing society into crisis and collapse. Does this sound familiar? Well, it should. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau actively collaborated in the Club of Rome in the late 1960s and early 1970s, sponsoring the second full meeting in Montebello, Quebec in 1971. This partnership was instrumental in developing the Limits to Growth report, which introduced systems of analysis and holistic policy modeling to the Canadian government. Trudeau met with Club of Rome founders Aurelio Pecci and Alexander King many times before the club was formally established in 1970. Trudeau implemented these ideas into Canadian law by creating the Department of the Environment and promoting a shift away from pure economic growth toward sustainable development and the Marxist concept of societal well-being. There is a documented history that mainstream Canadian media has almost completely ignored or deliberately obscured. Government memoranda, meeting records, academic journals, the Club of Rome's own published records. What they reveal is a direct line from a private meeting in Rome in 1968 to the policies destroying Canada today. Pierre Elliot Trudeau met with the Club of Rome, now the World Economic Forum, long before we had a Department of the Environment. He had Canada sponsor the meeting where the blueprint for global degradation was first developed, and the agenda that Trudeau embedded into Canadian institutions over 50 years ago is still being constructed right now by the Carney Liberals. The influence of this collaboration extended through the Trudeau era, which ended in 1984, affecting institutions like the Ministry of State for Science and Technology and the International Development Research Centre. The Club of Rome's direct influence upon Canadian policy waned significantly after 1984 due to a political paradigm shift and aging of its key contexts. However, with the election of Justin Trudeau in 2015, these nefarious policies experienced a renaissance that we are living through today. The Carney version of this agenda is far more dangerous than anything envisioned by Pierre Trudeau and reveals where this is all heading next. We do roughly 75% of our trade with the U.S. They share our border, our culture, our history, and frankly, our entire economic reality. They help us to protect the North from Chinese and Russian invasion. And whatever you might think about President Trump and the current tension with Washington, the idea that Canada's future lies with Brussels and the EU instead of the United States is not a rational trade argument. The EU is our second largest trading partner, but it's not even close to what we do with the Americans. The mathematics alone should end this conversation. So why is it not going away? Well, because this is not about trade. It is about something far more sinister. The explanation begins with an understanding of who Mark Carney was before he was installed as our prime minister. not the central banker biography or his actual CV. Goldman Sachs, Bank of Canada, Bank of England, World Economic Forum Foundation Board, Bilderberg Steering Committee, Brookfield Asset Management, United Nations Special Envoy, and now the highest office in the Canadian government. Every single step on that ladder shares a single guiding core belief, which comes right out of the Club of Rome playbook, that the problems of the modern world are too large for individual nations to solve on their own, and that the future belongs to institutions that sit above domestic governments or their puny constituents, whom we call voters. That sovereignty, as we have traditionally understood the term, is a relic of a world that has been ruptured, which no longer exists. The notion that national sovereignty is an obstacle to solving global problems is not something Carney developed recently. It runs through every institution he has ever been a part of, every framework he has ever built, every speech he has ever delivered, including his now famous New World Order address at Davos earlier this year. He did not spend 2 decades building a $130 trillion net zero financial alliance and proposed replacing the US dollar with a synthetic global currency managed by central banks because he believes in the power of individual nations to govern themselves. Carney has a particular worldview that is entirely consistent and now runs Canada. Once we understand this, the proposed EU move stops looking like foreign policy and starts looking more like something else entirely. The EU is the most advanced experiment in supranational governments ever. It has its own courts, its own parliament, its own currency, its own regulatory bodies that override domestic laws in 27 member states. It also happens to have been the primary institutional home for the exact policy agenda Carney has been building since 2015. Carbon disclosure frameworks, net zero financial commitments, central bank digital currencies, ESG integration into capital requirements. The EU did not borrow these ideas from Carney. No, he was building them as fast as the EU could institutionalize them. They are Carney's brainchildren. Do not forget either that Carney's time as governor of the Bank of England was spent installing such policies, which the British people rejected via Brexit. Aligning Canada with the EU thus has nothing to do with trade diversification. It is instead Canada being plugged into the architecture that Carney spent 2 decades building. An architecture with a sluggish economy, energy self-harm, and creeping authoritarianism that make it a terrible alternative to U.S. dynamism. President Trump's careless comments about Canada becoming the 51st state have certainly stirred latent Canadian patriotism, but it might also result in an economically moribund Canada further aligning itself with the permanent EU bureaucracy. As we have seen, a tilt toward Europe would be natural for Prime Minister Carney. He is an advocate of the very environmental, social, and economic policies that led the EU and Canada into economic and social decline. Carney is the ultimate product of the Euro-Atlantic elite. He holds British and Irish passports and has even self-identified as European. In the Prime Minister's office, we can only expect Carney to epitomize the bureaucratic spirit of the profoundly dysfunctional EU. The central planning principle of the EU disdains nation-states. Recent anti-democratic moves to remove troublesome populists in Romania, France, and now Hungary show how Europe's most outspoken defenders of democracy and freedom are being strategically removed, sometimes even by ignoring election results. The rest of the EU agenda is no bargain either. It prioritizes an ever-expanding welfare state as well as climate, social, and immigration policies that the Trump administration has thoroughly rejected. The EU's politics and economics focus upon sustainability and not growth. This is a siren song that we Canadians must resist. Under Justin Trudeau, Canada was already succumbing to the essentials of Euro politics, high trade barriers, net zero climate policies, essentially open borders, and the systemic undermining of our nation's proud history. Climate is particularly challenging. Carney has a long and sordid history, including as UN Special Envoy for Climate Action, of steering investment to preferred green sectors. American investors have already rejected such failed ESG commitments. Many Canadians, especially intellectuals and mass media actors, may find this appealing, but it is a recipe for disaster. It is made on a national scale. A declared war on oil and gas production, mining, and industry presents serious drawbacks for a country whose chief exports are energy and raw materials. Cutting off exports to the U.S. will have little impact since the Americans are now, under Trump, suddenly the world's leading energy producer. While Carney's aristocratic and progressive demeanor may thrill Laurentian elites, this is hardly the case for Canadian miners, oil producers, truckers, and other blue-collar workers. His first year in office has already fomented growing unrest in places like Alberta, whose economy propels the remnants of Canadian competitiveness internationally. Industrial workers in places like Southern Ontario, already facing the consequences of Trump's tariffs, are particularly threatened. Europe's energy leadership on climate and its net zero policies are undermining its fading industrial economy, all to the benefit of China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And speaking of China, in January of this year, Carney flew to Beijing, shook hands with Xi Jinping, called China a strategic partner, and signed 8 agreements in just 4 days. Most of us heard about canola tariffs. What we did not hear about was the police cooperation memorandum of understanding between the RCMP and China's Ministry of Public Security, the full text of which has never been publicly released, nor did we hear about the cultural cooperation deal signed with China's evil propaganda ministry, or the Financial Regulatory Working Group, or the commitment to jointly implement UN Agenda 2030. And we certainly did not hear that a 2025 parliamentary inquiry concluded that China was the most active perpetrator of state-based foreign interference targeting our democratic institutions, including our last 4 federal elections. These are people whom Carney now calls our strategic partner. Well, meanwhile, in Europe, strict adherence to climate zealot policy amounts to energy suicide. Late last year, Germany's economy suffered mightily due to a combination of cold weather, cloud cover, and light winds, forcing it to import power from Scandinavian nations. Germany, once the industrial engine of Europe with its nuclear and coal-powered economy, has been brought to its knees by the same insane climate policies that are crippling Canada. The really troubling thing is how economic collapse in the EU and here at home feels normal to so many people. There's a strange calm that settles over a country once they begin accepting the unacceptable, which is precisely what we have been doing in Canada over the past decade. Quite apart from all of the political and economic impacts of what the Carney liberals are doing, completely demoralizing us might actually be the true agenda. It is really more of a quiet resignation than a peaceful calm. It is the product of systemic indoctrination through our education system, media, and institutions, just as the Club of Rome planned it. We have now been trained since childhood to believe that truth flows from authority and that authority is innately good and incorruptible. Paired with this deception is the reality that any serious dissent is met with swift punishment. Disagreement with obvious absurdities or objection to baldly authoritarian behavior is met with censorship, accusations of misinformation, or outright cancellation and even personal ruin. Over time, that does something to a people. Canada's collective moral consciousness has been worn down by a persistent deluge of lies, of ideological radicalism, and of managed chaos. At its core, this is what it feels like to spend years spitting into the wind. We get tired, we grow weary of fighting while obvious truths are denied, and of watching institutions reward cowardice while punishing courage. Eventually, many of us simply cower and adapt. That is how the spiritual decline becomes normalized and accepted. This reality was not purely ushered in by those we have voted into office since 2015. Rather, it is a symptom of a deeper moral and spiritual dysfunction in our society as a whole. As it says in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. A healthy, culturally united, and patriotic society cannot be easily conquered. That is why we have seen persistent attacks on all these fronts over the past 20 years or so. The family unit has suffered heavy damage. Women were sold a counterfeit version of equality, one that taught them to see men less as complementary partners and more as competitors or even oppressors. Traditional roles like motherhood, homemaking, and building strong families were quietly devalued. Meanwhile, men were attacked in their traditional roles as leaders, as protectors, and as providers. They were recast in popular culture as bumbling fools and comic relief. The sanctity of marriage was also targeted, first by normalizing and then demanding cultural and legal affirmation of gay marriage. Now, our children are being subjected to some of the most absurd and disorienting ideologies imaginable. Any attempt to intervene in a child's confusion over their supposed gender identity can land parents in serious legal trouble. They can even lose their kids. And that is just on the family front. Canadian cultural identity and patriotism were attacked just as vilely through the deceitful leftist slogan that diversity is our strength. It has a bit of that war is peace flavor from Orwell's 1984, doesn't it? On the surface, it sounds all nice and inclusive. It also happens to be a perfect lie. Strong countries are generally built around a cohesive cultural core, shared loyalties, and a history that people can both know and honor. In Canada, we have a rich shared history and genuine stories of courage. The March West of the Northwest Mounted Police, the Hudson's Bay Company, construction of our national railways, navigation of the Northwest Passage by the RCMP, the two world wars, and countless others. The average Canadian teenager knows next to nothing about this history and is taught not to care about it. We cannot celebrate our heroes. We cannot teach national pride with confidence. Instead, we must teach our youth to look inward, to doubt themselves, to apologize, and to loathe their own shared history. We teach them to habitually navel gaze. To further erode our cultural cohesion, mass immigration has been pursued at a scale no serious country can absorb without severe consequences. Many newcomers now arrive from cultures with very different understandings about God, about law, liberty, about women, family, and the relationship of citizen to the state. Historically, most immigrants to Canada came from nations which broadly shared our ideals, our legal traditions, and our moral framework. A high trust society cannot remain so when the people running it actively dissolve the moral terms that made it all work. What we are witnessing now is a demoralized society that barely recognizes itself and has little collective memory of where it came from or where it is going. That is an apt description of a post-nation state. And this is what demoralization of a nation looks like. A people cut off from our shared memories, uncertain and ashamed of our national identity, and increasingly unable to defend the conditions that made our country livable. It was an ex-KGB defector, Yuri Bezmenov, who was given asylum in Canada by, you guessed it, Pierre Trudeau back in the 1970s, who described this process. His warning was not merely about propaganda, but about the gradual demoralization of a people. The goal was to alter a population's perception of reality so completely that even an abundance of information would no longer help them arrive at rational conclusions to defend themselves, their families, or their nation. The point was not just to deceive people, but to disarm them mentally, morally, and most of all, spiritually. The COVID pandemic ought to have been the moment when millions of Canadians awakened to distrust concentrated power. It should have been the time when we recognized how quickly rights, livelihoods, dignity, and basic honesty could be cast aside in the name of public safety. Instead, many Canadians learned the exact opposite lesson. They learned to keep quiet and to comply faster. They also learned that if they repeated state-approved slogans, avoided asking the wrong questions, and reported dissenters, they might be spared the worst treatment by our governments. We saw people informing on their neighbors for seeing family at Christmas. We watched healthy people lose their jobs because they refused injection with an experimental drug they did not trust and which was dishonestly presented to them as a safe and effective cure to a fake, deadly virus. We saw world-renowned subject matter experts censored and canceled, dissent criminalized, and obvious contradictions mount week after week. We saw fear become policy and coercion become virtuous. And instead of learning that abuse of power must be resisted early, many concluded instead that survival depends upon blind obedience. Some of these people included political leaders, judges, police officers, all of whom wielded significant societal influence. That is the true legacy of COVID in Canada. Not merely the mandates, the lockdowns, or censorship, but the psychological lessons so many of us absorb from it. Keep your head down, say as little as possible, and just do what you're told. Once a population internalizes these lessons, it becomes much easier to govern through panic, through intimidation, and through social pressure than through truth. Bezmenov put it even more bluntly, quote, "A person who is demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, authentic proof, documents, pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him the concentration camps, he will refuse to believe it until a military boot crashes his balls. Then he will understand, but not before that." End quote. In Canada, we have become so attached to comfort, to security, and to social acceptance that we refuse to face what is plainly in front of us. This is true not only of the public, but of professionals, officials, and authority figures who know better and still choose compliance over courage. The cost of dissent feels too high, so we keep our heads down and just go along with it. Canadians have always been known as nice folks, and that sounds complimentary, but it is actually an insult. Nice people are appeasers who are easily manipulated. They agree outwardly to keep the peace, even when they privately know it is wrong to go along. They are deeply afraid of standing apart from the consensus on any controversial issue. They are not prepared to pay the cost of discipleship. So they conform to the strongest social pressure in the room and go with the flow, regardless of whether it takes them over a waterfall. A nice, people-pleasing population is one ripe for ideological capture. Canada does not only punish dissent formally, it also sanctions it socially, which for most people is more than enough to make them fall into line. Justin Trudeau once described vaccine holdouts as extremists who, quote, "don't believe in science and are often misogynists and racists." He even questioned whether the unvaccinated should be tolerated in society. And the media did its part too. One famous Toronto Star headline told readers that the unvaccinated could die and deserved no sympathy. Now remember, we've been conditioned to believe that truth only comes from authority. So when Prime Minister Carney, the media, and every institutional loudspeaker is pushing the same line, nice people collapse immediately under that kind of pressure. You know, it is truly painful to see Canada in this sorry state. A beautiful and blessed country has been corrupted by ideological extremism, institutional cowardice, and a ruling class which profits as working class Canadians foot the bill. It is truly tragic. If this sounds overly pessimistic, then so be it. I am no people pleaser or appeaser. Sir Winston Churchill once described appeasement as keeping a pet crocodile, hoping that it will eat you last. What we must understand is that demoralization begets passivity, and passivity invites abuse. That is why ideological subversion is such an effective weapon. It does not merely confuse us, it renders us morally and spiritually unable to defend ourselves while our society is quietly dismantled around us. Once we begin adapting to the changes instead of resisting them, the planned decline accelerates. And this is where we are in Canada today. Not merely in political trouble, but in a deeper, moral, civilizational crisis. We are ruled by corrupt and dangerous people, yes, but that is only half the problem. The other half is a population so conditioned by comfort, by conformity, by fear, by sin, that many no longer respond to obvious danger as free men and women. We can be shown the evidence, the lies, the corruption, the coercion, and still reject any conclusion which demands courage, that require us to confront what has been done to us, what we allowed, and what it will cost to resist. Worst of all, what we tolerate long enough, we eventually accept. The EU, the European Union, is a cemetery for states who have given up the ghost of their best dreams of nationhood. That is why Carney and company want to take us there for a proper burial. But a free society does not perish once the first lie is told or when the first freedom is violated. It dies when its people lose the nerve to defend truth. Long before the official obituary, a moment arrives when a nation's collapse is already visible in the character of its people. That is the greatest danger in Canada today, not simply that the country is broken, but that so many of us have been demoralized enough to watch it happen and still call it normal. Close with a quotation from G.K. Chesterton, which reads, "Courage is almost a contradiction in terms. It means a strong desire to live, taking the form of a readiness to die."
Hungry for truth beyond the television? Well, extend the conversation with Grey Matter online. Grey Matter's insights continue in your inbox. Subscribe to our Substack newsletter where we dive deeper into the spiritual battles facing Canadian families today. Equip yourself to stand firm in your faith and lead with godly wisdom. Join our growing community of truth seekers at substack.com/Grey Matter newsletter. Subscribe today and never miss the Canadian perspective on what matters most. In a world where truth is under siege, legal expert Leighton Gray's book, Lies, Laws, and Liberty, delivers the intellectual firepower you need. 17 powerful essays tackle our most pressing challenges, from free speech to family values. Don't just witness cultural upheaval, help shape what comes next. This isn't just another book, it's your roadmap to becoming a joyful warrior for truth, family, and freedom. Order on Amazon today and arm yourself with wisdom for the battles that matter most. The battle has always been over people and ideas, but they're just the targets. The real enemies are spiritual principalities and powers. Grey Matter's purpose is to reach out with the voice of Christian truth to men between 18 and 44. We believe that these sons and fathers are Christ's inheritance. Join us financially and help us to speak so Canadians hear truth that sets men free and brings families to Jesus. Contact us by email at greymatterconnect@gmail.com or mail us at Post Office Box 2436, Fort Macleod, Alberta, postal code T0L0Z0. Thank you for your support.